It started on a cold October night, the kind where the wind cuts through your jacket like a knife. Bear Creek had always been a favorite camping spot for my friends and me, tucked away deep in the northern Michigan woods. The area was quiet, remote, and far from the usual hiking trails. We loved that about it. No tourists, no distractions, just the peace of the wilderness. But that night, peace was the last thing we found. There were four of us, me, Jackson, Sam, and his younger sister, Megan. We'd been camping at Bear Creek since we were kids, a tradition passed down from our fathers. They always spoke of the wildlife in the area, deer, foxes, the occasional black bear, but nothing ever dangerous. We'd never had a reason to worry. That night, though, something felt off from the moment we arrived. The forest seemed quieter than usual, unnervingly still. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves as we made our way to the campsite. Even the usual rustling of squirrels or the distant howls of wolves were absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We set up camp by the creek just before dusk, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the water. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, but something else lingered in the air, something foul, like rotting meat. Jackson wrinkled his nose and joked that maybe a deer had died nearby. We laughed it off and got a fire going, figuring the smell would pass. It didn't. As night fell, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It clung to the air, making it hard to breathe without gagging. Sam threw a few more logs onto the fire, and we all huddled around it, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But then Megan spoke up. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all went silent, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, faintly, in the distance, something. It was a low growl, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else. Jackson scoffed, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just some animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the growling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and it wasn't alone. There was a second growl, then a third, all around us, as if we were being surrounded. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart racing. The fire cast long, flickering shadows, making it hard to see anything beyond the first few rows of trees. The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Something was coming. "Did you bring a gun?" Sam whispered to me, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head. "I didn't think we'd need one." Megan grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all we saw were trees. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting back at us. Just the oppressive stillness of the forest. But the footsteps were getting closer, and then we saw it. A figure stepped out from the trees, just beyond the edge of the firelight. At first, I thought it was a man. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, but its posture was wrong, hunched over, almost like it was walking on its toes. And then, the light caught its face. My blood ran cold. Its head was that of a wolf, with a long snout and sharp, gleaming teeth, but its eyes, they were human, dark, intelligent, and filled with something primal, something hungry. The creature stared at us for what felt like an eternity, its breath visible in the cold night air, rising in short, sharp bursts. Sam muttered something under his breath, but none of us moved. We were frozen, locked in a silent standoff with this thing. And then, without warning, it let out a snarl so loud, so vicious, that it felt like the ground shook beneath us. Jackson was the first to snap out of it. "Run!" he screamed, and we all bolted in different directions. I don't know how long I ran or where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. The sound of the creature's growl echoed in the trees behind me, and I could hear the heavy thudding of its footsteps as it chased after us. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned with the effort of running, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening. No growls, no footsteps, just the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it, but then I heard the scream. It was Megan. I turned and ran back toward the sound, adrenaline surging through my veins. When I found her, she was backed up against a tree, flashlight in hand, her face pale with terror. The creature was standing in front of her, its massive body blocking her path. It bared its teeth, saliva dripping from its jaws. Without thinking, I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it at the creature with all the strength I had. It barely flinched, but it did turn its head toward me, those dark eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I was done for. But then, the creature let out a low growl and backed away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. I grabbed Megan's hand, and we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the road, where Jackson and Sam were waiting by the car, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. None of us spoke as we piled into the car and sped away from Bear Creek, leaving the campsite, and whatever that thing was, behind us. We never went back. I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was the Dogman, the legendary creature rumored to roam the forests of Michigan. Or maybe it was something else, something even older, something that's been lurking in those woods long before we ever set foot there. All I know is that it wasn't human, and it wasn't just an animal. It was something in between, something monstrous, and it's still out there. It was supposed to be a simple drive home, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd taken this route dozens of times before. Shadow Ridge Road, a narrow two-lane road that cut through miles of dense forest. The trees here grew so close to the road that their branches often brushed against the car windows if you strayed too close to the edge. It was always a bit eerie, especially at night, but I never thought much of it. Until that night, I was driving back from my sister's place, a little later than usual. It was close to midnight, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine, and occasionally, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Shadow Ridge was a lonely stretch, and it wasn't uncommon to go miles without seeing another vehicle. Most people avoided it at night, but it shaved a good 30 minutes off my commute, and I wasn't one to waste time. The first thing that felt off was the silence. I know that sounds strange. How can silence feel wrong? But it did. I'd driven through these woods countless times, and I'd grown accustomed to the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. That night, though, there was nothing. No insects, no wind, not even the distant call of a night bird. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. I turned up the radio, trying to shake the feeling, but the static was unbearable. Every station was drowned in white noise, even the ones that usually came in clear. It was almost as if the air itself had thickened, blocking out all sound. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only a small patch of road ahead of me. I kept my eyes on the pavement, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at my gut. But then, something darted across the road. It happened so fast that I barely registered it, a flash of movement, too quick to make out any details, but large enough to force me to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched as my car skidded to a halt, the smell of burnt rubber filling the air. My heart was pounding in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel, staring into the dark woods where the thing had disappeared. What the hell was that? I muttered to myself. I sat there for a moment, listening, hoping that whatever it was would show itself again. Maybe it was just a deer, I thought, though I'd never seen one move so fast. My hands were still shaking as I slowly eased my foot off the brake and started driving again, more cautiously this time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few minutes later, I saw something again this time. It was standing at the edge of the road, just barely within the beam of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a person, tall and thin, with long arms hanging at its sides. But then I saw its face, or what should have been a face. Its head was misshapen, almost canine, with large pointed ears and a long snout. But its eyes, those eyes were wrong. They were too human, glowing yellow and full of something dark, something predatory. I froze, my foot hovering over the brake as I stared at this thing, unable to move. It took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of it, slamming my foot on the gas and speeding past it. My heart was racing, and my palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing after me, but the road was empty. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth between the road and the woods, waiting for it to appear again. The silence had returned, even heavier than before. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting, and then I heard it, a howl, long and low, echoing through the trees. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like a scream. It sent a chill down my spine, and I pressed down on the gas pedal, urging the car to go faster. But no matter how fast I drove, the howling followed me, growing louder, closer. Then, out of nowhere, something slammed into the side of my car. The impact sent me veering off the road, the tires skidding on the loose gravel as I struggled to regain control. I slammed on the brakes just as the car came to a stop, the front bumper crashing into a tree. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it. No signal. I cursed under my breath, glancing out the window. The woods were impossibly dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I didn't want to get out of the car. I didn't even want to look outside. But I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever had hit my car was still out there, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out what it was. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, but it did little to mask the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out into the darkness. I turned back to the car, fumbling with the door handle, when I heard it again, those footsteps, closer this time, slow and deliberate, like something was stalking me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it, standing in the middle of the road, its body illuminated by the moonlight. It was the same thing I'd seen earlier, but now there was no mistaking it. It wasn't human. It stood on two legs, but its posture was all wrong, hunched over, its arms too long, its claws dragging against the ground. Its fur was matted and dark, almost blending in with the shadows, but its eyes, those eyes glowed like fire in the darkness. The thing let out a low growl, baring its teeth, and I knew I was out of time. I dove back into the car, slamming the door shut just as it lunged toward me. The car shook with the force of the impact, the windows rattling as the creature clawed at the doors, trying to get in. I frantically tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. My hands were shaking, sweat dripping down my face as I fumbled with the keys. Outside, the creature was circling the car, its claws scraping against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the paint. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing down the road as fast as the car would go. I didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe until I saw the lights of the nearest town in the distance. I never drove down Shadow Ridge Road again after that night. I don't know what I saw, but I'm certain of one thing. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a legend. The Dogman is real. And it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me and my girlfriend, Kira, heading to a cabin up north, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. We both needed the break. Work had been crazy, and we hadn't had any time for ourselves in months. The plan was simple: pack up the car, drive out to the cabin on Friday evening, and spend the weekend hiking, fishing, and enjoying the quiet. But we never made it to the cabin. Route 19 was the main road that cut through miles of thick forest before finally winding its way up to the lake where our cabin was waiting. It wasn't a particularly busy road, especially at night, and we hadn't passed another car in over an hour. The sun had already set, and the headlights of my old Subaru were the only source of light as we drove deeper into the wilderness. "Are we almost there?" Kira asked, her voice sleepy. She had been dozing off for the last half hour, her head resting against the window. "Yeah, just about 20 more minutes," I replied, glancing at the GPS on my phone. The signal had been spotty for the last few miles, but it seemed like we were still on track. I turned the radio down, the crackling static filling the silence. Route 19 was narrow, with barely any shoulder, and the trees loomed so close to the road that they seemed to swallow us in darkness. It was unsettling, to say the least, but I tried to push the feeling aside. We were almost there, just a little longer. That's when I saw something at the edge of the road. It was barely a flicker of movement, just outside the beam of my headlights, but enough to make me slow down. My first thought was that it was a deer. We were in the middle of the forest, after all, and animals often wander too close to the road. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer. It was standing on two legs. I hit the brakes, hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Kira jerked awake, startled by the sudden stop. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. There's something on the road," I said, my voice shaky. We both peered out into the darkness, the headlights barely illuminating the figure standing at the edge of the road. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, and its body was covered in thick, dark fur. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but then I saw its face. It looked like a wolf, but with eyes that were disturbingly human, glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. Kira let out a gasp, clutching my arm. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my eyes locked on the creature. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Its chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, the mist of its exhalation visible in the cold night air. And then, without warning, it let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step toward the car. "Drive!" Kira shouted, her voice filled with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The creature didn't move at first, just watched as we sped past. But then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. It was running after us. The road was narrow and winding, and I could feel the car swaying as I pushed it to go faster. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Kira was staring out the back window, her breath coming in short gasps. "It's still there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and sure enough, the creature was still behind us, sprinting on all fours like an animal. But its gait was wrong, unnatural. It was fast, too fast, and gaining on us with every second. Come on," I muttered under my breath, urging the car to go faster. We tore around a sharp curve, the tires skidding on the gravel, and for a moment, I thought we might have lost it. But then I heard it, scratching, like claws raking against metal. I whipped my head around and saw the creature's massive hand clawing at the back of the car, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. It was right there, almost close enough to touch. "Get off!" I shouted, swerving the car violently. The creature lost its grip, tumbling to the side of the road as we sped away. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing. For the next few miles, we didn't say a word. Kira was trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched the seatbelt across her chest. I was breathing heavily, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing after us again. But it was gone, or at least, I hoped it was. We didn't talk about it until we reached the nearest town, pulling into the parking lot of a small diner that was still open. I parked the car and turned to Kira, my hands still shaking. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. But it wasn't an animal. It was something else." We sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The diner was quiet, the only sound the soft murmur of voices from inside and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I could still hear the creature's growl in my head, could still feel its claws raking against the car. "We need to get out of here," Kira said suddenly, her voice trembling. "We need to go back home." I nodded, knowing she was right. There was no way we were going to make it to the cabin after what we'd just seen. I didn't want to drive back through those woods, but I didn't see any other option. We couldn't stay here, not with that thing out there. We left the diner and got back into the car, the engine sputtering to life as I pulled out of the parking lot. The road ahead was dark, but I kept my eyes on the headlights, refusing to look into the trees. Every shadow, every movement out of the corner of my eye made my heart race, but we didn't see the creature again. Not until we reached the end of Route 19. We were almost back to the main highway, the lights of the town visible in the distance, when Kira let out a gasp. "It's there," she shouted, pointing to the side of the road. I glanced over and saw it, the creature, standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. Its yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, and for a moment, I thought it might come after us again. But it didn't move. It just stood there, its head cocked to the side, as if it was studying. I floored the gas, speeding past it, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop until we reached the highway, the bright lights of the town finally making me feel like we were safe. But I knew deep down that we weren't. The creature was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The idea of going on a road trip had always been one of those someday dreams. My wife Taylor and I had been planning it for years. A long drive, just the two of us, heading out to some of the most scenic places across the country. We'd saved enough, bought a brand new SUV, and marked off 3 weeks from work. But even with all that planning, nothing could have prepared us for the Oak Ridge Trail. We were on the 4th day of our trip, and after spending a night in a cozy bed and breakfast in North Carolina, we were on our way to Tennessee. We'd read about a scenic detour through Oak Ridge National Forest, a winding, picturesque route with towering trees and breathtaking views of the Smoky Mountains. Perfect for what we thought was going to be a quiet, relaxing drive. It started as any normal day. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and we had just turned off the main highway onto the Oak Ridge Trail. The trees formed a canopy over the narrow road, filtering the sunlight into golden rays that danced on the windshield. Taylor had her phone out, taking pictures of everything: the trees, the wildflowers, the birds flitting between the branches. We were both in high spirits. As we drove deeper into the forest, the road became rougher, with more twists and turns, and the trees seemed to grow denser. After a while, the GPS on my phone lost signal, but I wasn't too concerned. I figured we'd come back into range soon enough. Taylor was chatting away, talking about how beautiful everything was, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice low and tense. "See what?" I glanced over at her, then back at the road. I hadn't noticed anything. "There was something in the trees," she said, her eyes scanning the forest beside us. I chuckled, trying to brush it off. Probably just a deer. "We're in the middle of a forest, after all." She didn't respond, her eyes still fixed on the passing trees, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her seat. I shrugged it off and focused on driving. The road was getting narrower, with more bumps and potholes, so I had to pay attention. A few minutes later, the car suddenly lurched forward, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a tire popping. I cursed under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road, the SUV leaning slightly to the right. "Great," I muttered, stepping out of the car to assess the damage. Sure enough, the front passenger side tire was flat. I groaned and opened the trunk to get the spare. It wasn't a big deal. I had changed tires before, and it wouldn't take long. But as I was kneeling down to get started, I heard something. A rustling in the trees behind me. I paused, holding my breath. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I glanced over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. "Hurry up," Taylor called from the car, her voice shaky. "I don't like this place." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up on me, and quickly changed the tire. I was almost done when I heard it again, this time closer. It wasn't just rustling. It was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No response. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked around to the driver's side, eager to get back on the road and away from whatever was out there. But just as I reached for the door handle, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, tall and hunched, moving between the trees about 50 feet from the car. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a deer. It was too tall, too upright. "Taylor, get in the car," I said, my voice low but urgent. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the passenger seat, her face pale, and I slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine. The tires spun on the gravel as I hit the gas, the car lurching forward onto the narrow road. For a moment, I thought we were in the clear. But then I saw it again, in the rearview mirror. Something was moving through the trees, keeping pace with the car. "Go faster," Taylor whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I pressed down on the gas, the car bouncing over the rough road as we sped up. But no matter how fast we went, the shadow in the trees stayed with us, darting between the trunks, always just on the edge of my vision. And then it stepped out of the trees, onto the road, right in front of us. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was standing there, in the middle of the road, staring at us. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with long, matted fur that covered its body. Its arms were too long, its fingers tipped with sharp claws that glinted in the fading sunlight. But it was its face that sent a chill down my spine. It looked almost human, but distorted, its features stretched and twisted, its eyes too large and glowing with an unnatural light. For a moment, we just sat there, frozen in fear. Then it moved. With terrifying speed, it charged toward the car, its claws slashing at the air. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning as we shot backward down the road. The creature was right behind us, its claws scraping against the back of the car with a high-pitched screech. "Go, go, go," Taylor screamed, her voice filled with panic. I hit the gas again, the car lurching forward as I swerved around the creature and sped down the road. The trees flew by in a blur, the car bouncing over the rough terrain as we raced to get away. But the creature was still following us. I could see it in the rearview mirror, sprinting after the car with terrifying speed. No matter how fast I drove, it kept up, its glowing eyes locked on us. "How is it still behind us?" Taylor whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We were approaching a bend in the road, and I knew we had to do something. If we kept driving like this, we'd either crash or the creature would catch us. I took a deep breath and made a split-second decision. "Hold on," I said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As we reached the bend, I swerved the car off the road and into the trees. The car bounced and jolted as we crashed through the underbrush, branches scraping against the windows. I kept going, not daring to slow down, until we were deep enough into the forest that I could no longer see the road. I killed the engine, my hands shaking as I sat there, listening. The forest was silent. No footsteps, no growls, nothing. "Do you think it's gone?" Taylor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes scanning the trees around us. For what felt like hours, we sat there in the dark, too scared to move. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches, made my heart race, but the creature never appeared. Eventually, We worked up the courage to start the car again and slowly made our way back to the road. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. We never spoke about what happened on the Oak Ridge Trail. Not to each other, not to anyone. But every time I get behind the wheel, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for us to come back. I've always loved driving at night. There's something peaceful about the empty roads, the way the world feels still and quiet under the stars. I've done it hundreds of times, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened, until that night. It started as a routine drive. I had a late night job interview in a small town about 3 hours away from my place, so I left around 9 p.m. The highway was mostly deserted, just a few cars passing by occasionally. My playlist was on, and I was feeling pretty relaxed, cruising along at a steady speed. The headlights illuminated the stretch of asphalt ahead of me, but beyond that, everything was swallowed up by the darkness. I'd been driving for about an hour when I noticed something strange. My headlights reflected off a pair of eyes glowing on the side of the road up ahead. It was odd because they were too high up to belong to any animal I could think of, a deer maybe, but these eyes seemed larger, more intense. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a sign or something, but as I got closer, I saw it. There was something standing at the edge of the road, just at the line where my headlights faded into the darkness. It was huge, easily over 6 feet tall, and covered in thick, dark fur. Its long arms hung at its sides, but what really got me was its face. It looked almost human, but the eyes, those glowing and blinking eyes, were far from normal. I slowed down, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I passed by. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those piercing eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop. I wasn't sure what I'd just seen, but every instinct told me to keep going. After I passed it, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting it to have disappeared. But it hadn't. It was still there, standing on the side of the road, its eyes following my car as I drove away. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It had to be my imagination, right? Maybe it was just a shadow or an animal I couldn't identify. But the image of those eyes stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The night felt different now, more oppressive, as if the darkness itself was watching me. I turned up the music, hoping it would calm my nerves, but it didn't help. Another 20 minutes passed before I saw something else. This time, it wasn't on the side of the road, it was in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague shape that seemed to be moving along the road behind me. But as I glanced back again, I realized with growing horror that it was getting closer. Fast, I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart racing as the car lurched forward. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want it anywhere near me. The shape in the rearview mirror grew larger, its form becoming clearer in the dim light of my taillights. It was running, on all fours now, like some kind of animal, but far too large and fast to be anything I recognized. I was going over 80 miles per hour, but it was still gaining on me. I could hear it now, the sound of its heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement, getting louder with each passing second. Come on, I muttered under my breath, pressing the gas pedal down as far as it would go. The car sped up, but so did the thing chasing me. My hands were shaking, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. And then it was right behind me. I could see it clearly in the rearview mirror now. Its massive, hulking form was covered in matted fur, and its eyes, those same glowing eyes, were locked on my car. Its mouth was open, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and I could hear its growls, deep and guttural, reverberating through the night. I swerved, trying to shake it off, but it was too fast, too agile. I could feel the car shaking as it got closer, its claws scraping against the rear bumper. "Please no," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. My mind was racing, desperately searching for a way out. But there was nothing. Just the empty highway and the dark woods on either side. And then, just as I thought it was going to catch me, the thing suddenly stopped. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my breath catching in my throat as I saw it standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. Its glowing eyes never left my car, even as the distance between us grew. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The creature stood up on its hind legs, towering over the road, and let out a howl, a bone, chilling, otherworldly sound that echoed through the night. And then, it turned and sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the trees in a matter of seconds. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, my heart racing, my hands shaking. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't going to give it another chance to catch me. It wasn't until I reached the small town where my interview was that I finally pulled over. My hands were still trembling as I parked the car and leaned back in my seat, trying to catch my breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness beyond. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Not my wife, not my friends, not even the police when I reported the damage to my car. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But every time I drive at night, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next car to come down that lonely stretch of highway.